The problematic prince. Erna curled up into herself, trying desperately to stay sheltered from the rain under the old clock tower. Not that it mattered, as she was soaked through. The rain had started up not long after she found Pavel's house stay cold and empty. They had agreed to meet under the clock tower in the afternoon, but as the sun started to set and he hadn't showed yet, Erna went to his house. That's when the rain started, and she returned to the clock tower. It was getting close to midnight now, and Erna's eyes were growing heavy. Without the money Pavel promised, she could not return to Buford. She didn't want to return to Hardy Mansion either, but she wasn't going to be able to escape her father. She could always go to the train station, do whatever she could to get back to Buford, and even if the trains were not running this late, she could find somewhere to stay for the night. Erna could not fight the emotions anymore. Anxiety gave way to despair, and she let herself give completely over to sadness. She cried as she sat on the cold, wet floor. The rain hid her tears. She felt abandoned and truly alone. She wished above all else that she was home in Buford with her grandmother, sitting by a warm fire. The rain stopped suddenly. Erna looked up from crying into her hands. The rain had stopped for her, but she could still hear the pitter-patter on concrete. Above the long shadow cast by the light of a gas lamp, she saw a pair of polished shoes standing close. And when she looked up,
Pavel.
She was about to ask, but the person she saw was Prince Bjorn. Erna couldn't believe her eyes. It was dark. She was tired. Tears blurred her vision, but it was still Bjorn that stood there, holding an umbrella over her. Bjorn didn't know how to handle the situation and just stood there, staring down at the hapless woman. They stared at each other for a long while, until a flash of lightning lit them up and the sound of thunder pushed them to action. Bjorn offered a hand, but Erna turned away from him. He considered her with his cold, gray eyes and face as implacable as ever. He knelt down beside her and turned her face toward hers by gently grabbing her chin. She trembled at his delicate touch. Bjorn sighed and muttered a curse under his breath. Erna did not hear. He moved his hand to cup Erna's cheek and ever so gently turned her face to meet his. She finally looked up at him properly, and they froze in time as their eyes met. Bjorn looked at Erna until the trembling stopped. Her eyes were bright and clear, but so full of sorrow, even in her surprise to see him, just like the time on the riverside. Bjorn thought that was the last time he was going to get to see her. Erna looked at Bjorn with wonder and was stuck somewhere between dream and reality. The running carriage, the pouring rain, sight clouded by heat, and in the middle of it all, Bjorn's face. It was like a very vivid dream. Why was he there? Did he know she was there? Was he looking for her? The question flickered through her tired mind, but Erna couldn't say anything because of struggling to stay awake. There was no energy for talking, only sleep. I don't know who you were waiting for, Miss Hardy, but it seems like that person is not coming. He abandoned you, Bjorn said. Erna barely heard. She was struggling with keeping her eyes open, and the rocking carriage didn't make it any easier. She tried to deny it, refusing the prince's cold words, but what else could it be? It was already past midnight by the time she reluctantly climbed into the carriage, and she promised she would give Pavel until midnight. Had he really abandoned her, her longtime friend? Bjorn let out a frustrated sigh. The cape and hat were waterlogged and clung to her body irritated him. He thought about throwing them away and being done with his irritation, but thought it would be more irritating without them, allowing the cold wind to bite at her skin. He watched Erna as she slowly drifted off to sleep and realized it was not her clothes that irritated him, it was her situation. It was clear to him now that it wasn't just forced marriage that pained this woman. The moment he saw her bruised face, he realized It was probably all the scandal that turned a ruthless man to violence against this beautiful flower. The first time Erna hid away from the public, I was soon after the first scandal hit the streets. Now Bjorn figured out why. Not out of shame or to keep a low profile, but because her own father turned his maliciousness on her. He scratched his most expensive and valuable wares. Walter Hardy was a pitiful merchant and a pitiful man. Cold anger seethed through him. There was so much of tonight that made him angry, from the moment he saw Erna collapse under the clock tower to the realization of her father and no doubt the man she was waiting for. It had to be a man. Why else would Erna willingly wait out in the bitter rain? She was probably going to run away with this disgraceful man that abandoned such a sweet rose. What hurt more was that this man was probably a close friend to Erna, or pretended to be. He probably took her money, promising to sort out all the travel arrangements and then flee the city at the last minute. Only thing is, Bjorn knew Erna didn't have enough money to attract scam artists. She barely had money selling flowers to pay off her debt to him, and that's when he had a thought. Erna had one other friend in the city, someone he had seen her with many times, an artist. Pavel, was it? Bjorn remembered seeing him at the Royal Academy of Arts. That's how he knew he was an artist. He was burly, red-haired young man. He seemed bright enough and not at all like someone who would go out of his way to harm a young lady. Bjorn suddenly thought of the genius poet of Lars. It was an unexpected memory of the man that had taken Gladys from him. He died a couple years ago, before he even turned 30, a talented artist who passed away young. With a cynical laugh, Bjorn scrubbed the thoughts from his mind and looked out the window. The dark, empty streets were so quiet, save for the clopping of horses' hooves and being drawn to the sound. He could hear the approach on the other side of the road. And sure enough, a single horse trundled past, and driving was a burly red-haired man. Pavel Lore, that was his name. Seeing the face made Bjorn remember the name. He had been wrong. Pavel had not abandoned Erna. The perfect manner in which seemingly random events fell in line made Bjorn smile as he watched the man trundle past. At least one thing was different from what he guessed, but it was not to Bjorn's liking. Thunder rumbled overhead and Erna stirred from her shallow slumber. She looked about with a vacant stare, the brief nap fogging her memory. She looked like a lost child, and it rubbed against Bjorn's nerves. The moment she looked out the window, Bjorn reacted instinctively and closed the curtains. There was no way she could spot Pavel now, but he wasn't willing to take that risk. Erna looked at him blankly, but sank back into her seat. With the situation back under predictable control, Bjorn let out a deep sigh and closed his eyes. They sat in silence for the rest of the journey. It wasn't long before the carriage turned into Terra Boulevard, where the Hardy mansion was. The driver knocked on the door to let the passengers know they were at their destination. Bjorn moved to take Erna into his arms, wrapping a spare cloak around her as he did so. Then he had a thought. He opened the door and gave the driver an order, who was surprised at the words spoken to him, but Bjorn was the prince, and so the driver followed his order without question, confused as he was. Bjorn tried to put Erna back into her seat, but she nestled into him like he was a giant teddy bear, no doubt finding the warmth of him comforting. She stirred a little as the carriage moved off again. It did not go to the Schubert Palace, but to somewhere in the northern part of the city. I demands you give her back right this instant. Baroness Baden skipped any formalities and went right to the heart of the matter. She was being neither calm nor graceful, but she didn't care. "What are you talking about?" Walter said. He stank of alcohol and had a slack-jawed expression on his face. His hair was greasy and his complexion was deathly pale. Along with his sloppy outfit, the Baroness could see that Walter had fallen a long way since the last time she saw him. "I'm talking about you giving Erna back into my care. The Baroness said once more. Why? I don't want Erna to leave with you anymore. You're a terrible father, and you have ruined that poor girl's reputation. Look here, you old crone. If it wasn't for me, you would have lost the house. So you should be more careful about the accusations you throw around. Walter said. I don't need that house. The Baroness bluffed, sticking out her neck. She had been willing to lose the house ever since she discovered how Erna was being treated, and the few employees that worked at the mansion felt the same. It's just a house, the Baroness continued. Keep it, sell it, do as you wish, but I am not leaving without Erna. You can't be serious, Walter said, stuck for words. He looked at his ex-mother-in-law with narrowed eyes and a fierce expression. Erna didn't go back to Buford, he said softly. The Baroness almost didn't hear he. What do you mean? Erna went back to Buford. All the sharpness had gone from the Baroness, and now her voice was trembling a little. Had they lost Erna? Walter let out a harsh laugh, sobering a little. Maybe the old woman didn't know where Erna was after all. He didn't seem like the type to secret away a young girl. He had doubted Erna would have run away with him in the first place. But then, the cunning little thing had run away all the same. But where? It was the morning after the storm that they realized Erna was gone. They were brought about the knowledge of her disappearance by Erna's maid, Lisa, who called out and dropped the breakfast tray she had been carrying. Erna Hardy has disappeared. Walter had drunk the night away and was in no state to do anything about Erna running off. It was nothing to worry about, after all. The only place she could go was back to that poky little village. He intended to go out and get her back when he sobered up and could be bothered. Now that her value was minimal, there was no rush in marrying her off. Maybe if you weren't so drunk, you might have noticed your own daughter running off, the Baroness said with all the malice she could muster. I was a fool to send Erna away to you, just because you were her father. The Baroness continued. Her legs could barely keep her upright, and she left on shaky legs, fire and malice pouring forth in her words. Madam, are you okay? Mrs. Grieve asked as the Baroness came out of the drawing room. She had been pacing up and down the hallway and approached Baroness Baden with tears in her eyes. The Baroness took up Mrs. Grieve's hands and gave them a light squeeze. Erna is... I need to speak to an officer, the Baroness said. A police officer? Yes, they say Erna is not here. Baroness Baden glanced at Mrs. Grieve with tears in her blue eyes. She has run away. Unlike the leisurely South, which was more like a resort, the North was much busier and more dynamic. Schuber was the central port city of Luchen, and to say that it was the busiest in all the continent was not a stretch. It was certainly one of the most financially prosperous. There was no sign of the storm anymore, and as Bjorn stood on the balcony that overlooked the harbor, across a forest of masts that stretched out to the sky, he looked up and bathed in the warm sun. It was a typical Luchen summer day. The townhouse was in a particularly good location, located right on the edge of the residential area and the financial district. He bought it as soon as it was put on the market. The previous owner fell for some investment scam and had to sell a lot of assets to cover the loss. Your Highness, Mrs. Fitz said. She was looking at him with a stern expression. Mrs. Fitz, Bjorn replied. When Bjorn had brought Erna to this townhouse, he immediately sent for his own doctor and for Mrs. Fitz. He knew he could trust these two above all else, even if the doctor grated against Mrs. Fitz's nerves. Mrs. Fitz had scolded him for bringing the young Hardy family girl to the townhouse, but seeing her pale complexion, she soon changed her tune. The doctor confirmed what Bjorn had suspected, and now Miss Erna laid up in bed, sick. Bjorn still owed Mrs. Fitz an explanation. Bjorn went into the room, closely followed by Mrs. Fitz with a full tea tray. She busied herself preparing the breakfast. They sat in silence for a long while, even after Mrs. Fitz left. Erna stared down at her hands, which she had not stopped fidgeting with the entire time. She became distinctly aware of the ticking of the clock. "Have some tea," Bjorn said. "Thanks to you, Your Highness, I am well again," Erna said, putting down the teacup. Bjorn looked down at Erna, studying her rosy cheeks, pouty lips, and the thin nape of her neck. He stopped when he looked at the bow of her dress that sat perfectly central on the neckline. She did not look as sickly as she had done, but she was still pale. Bjorn laughed as the memory of the night came to him. The cloak had been removed, but Erna was soaked through to the skin. She could not lay down in the wet cloths, so simply leaned against the couch. She stood there, shivering with her eyes closed. "You need to change out of those wet clothes immediately," Bjorn demanded. Erna was surprised at Bjorn's forceful words, and when she didn't comply right away, he came over and roughly started pulling at her dress. I can do it. I can do it myself," Erna said, feebly pushing the prince away. Bjorn realized that she may think he was aiming to molest her in her weakened state, so he quickly stepped away and let Erna remove the wet clothes herself. All he could do was bring her a towel and her trunk. He then left the room, but kept an ear to the door just in case Erna should collapse. There was the sounds of thumping and scraping, groans, and heavy sighs. He could hear her rummaging through her trunk. Bjorn looked down at his pocket watch when things got a little too quiet for his liking. It had been 10 minutes. Was it better to be accused of being a molester than have a young girl's life on his conscience? So, Bjorn let himself in. Erna was laid out on the couch in her pajamas and soaking up the heat of the fire. To his surprise, she had managed to get all her clothes on straight and all the buttons done up properly. She had even managed to tie the ribbon of the nightgown. Bjorn very softly walked up to Erna and gingerly picked her up and cradled the surprisingly light girl in his arms. He took her to the guest bedroom and laid her under the warm blankets. Your Highness?" Erna said softly, half asleep. "Thank you," was all she could manage. "It's okay, Miss Hardy, get some rest." "No, I cannot let you get involved, scandal," she muttered. "I have a friend," he worried, looking for me. "A friend? You mean Pavel Lore?" Bjorn said. Erna's eyes shot open at the mention of the name, and she looked at the prince, confused. Bjorn simply looked at her with a smile. "Right, Pavel Lore, the promising artist from the academy. He tried to escape with you, didn't he?" Erna was silent for a long moment. "Do you know Pavel Lore, Your Highness?" she asked in disbelief. "No, I believe you told me about him at some point."
Bjorn lead skillfully.
Erna couldn't believe it as she tried to recall when she might have mentioned Pavel's name. She never took her gaze from the prince as she became lost to her own memory. She became unreserved. "So, no one knows except the prince," Erna said. "Maybe," was all the prince said, in his usual flat tone. What a relief. I was so worried if word had spread. She smiled nervously. The smile distorted the bruising on her face from her father's beatings. No doubt she had some on her body as well, but Erna smiled as she talked about Pavel. Could it be that they are in fact lovers? As bewildered as Bjorn is, Erna's smile grew brighter. "Please keep it secret, Your Highness, please. If rumors were to spread, Pavel would be in a lot of trouble." "Why? There are most likely already rumors spreading of your attempt to run away with a lover. Maybe you should prepare for that," Bjorn said. "What? Me and Pavel lovers? It's not like that at all," Erna said, eyes wide. "Oh, well, I had assumed the rest of the city will too," Bjorn said. "Pavel is a friend. He is practically family, We would never. Erna cut herself, thinking. He was just going to lend me money and help me get back to Buford. He was heading back anyway, so offered to take me with him. For money, Bjorn said. Erna shrunk away as she realized she had let out more than she intended. How did she keep getting caught out by this man? She felt like she wanted to disappear somewhere and forget about pride. Why do you borrow money from Pavel Lore? Bjorn asked. His eyes deepened as he looked at her. She had thought his eyes were so beautiful when she looked into them at the festival. That made her even more miserable. It would have been nice if that moment had never happened. Embarrassed by the fleeting memory, Erna bowed her head and caught sight of her lace gowns laid out on the table. With them came the memory of her soaking wet in the rain and seeing Bjorn's carriage trundling out of the dark. The water that dripped from her dirted the prince's pristine carriage. "Miss Hardy," Bjorn's voice urged. "Tell me, Miss Hardy." Bjorn's gray eyes pierced into her soul, but they were still as beautiful as that night on the river.
Pavel, ochmy, Pavel, midir.
"Our Erna is missing," the Baroness said. "It's been over a day since we reported it, but no one has seen a single strand of hair," the Baroness said. She wiped the tears away with the corner of a kerchief. "I told them about you. Being the only other person Erna knew in the city, I hope that didn't get you into any trouble." No, of course not, Baroness," Pavel said quietly. He felt like he was being strangled. He recalled the night as clear as if it just happened. The rockfall showed no signs of being cleared up in good time, so Pavel headed out to look for a stagecoach or anything that could be heading to Schuber. All the stagecoach depots were closed for the night, and the only thing Pavel could find was a post station. Pavel felt shameful that he didn't make it in time, and now he was racked with guilt. She had not been at the station or under the clock tower. He shouted himself hoarse as he rode all over town, calling her name and catching a cold at the same time. He worried that she got caught sneaking out of the house. Or maybe she got cold feet and decided not to go, or maybe she decided to head to Buford on her own. It had been dawn by the time Pavel had given up searching the streets and went round to the Hardy mansion. The maid was the one who answered the door, who told Pavel that Miss Hardy was sick in bed and could not come to the door. He breathed a little easier, knowing that Erna had made it safely back home, but there was something in the way the maid looked at him. "Pavel, my dear boy, are you okay?" the Baroness asked. She examined him and could see concern on his face, the face any boy made when they were about to do something foolish. Pavel looked at the Baroness with a flushed face. "Yes, Baroness, I'm fine," Pavel said. His palms felt clammy. "It's okay," the Baroness reassured him. Even during the moment of cowardly evasiveness, Pavel would have to face the truth and, at the very least, tell the police officer. "I'll give you the money." Bjorn finally broke the silence that had stood between them for a long moment. "The money you were going to borrow from Pavel Lore, I will give it to you instead," Bjorn said, hoping the clear explanation would help. Viscount Hardy was a despicable man for using his daughter to clear his debts and descent into poverty, to make a deal with a young girl, promising to let them keep Baden Mansion in Buford, all so that he could get her to Lutchen and sell her off in marriage. Erna had suffered nothing but hardship since coming to the city. It was not enough for him to get involved in the affairs of a disgraceful man and his young daughter, but part of Erna's hardship was his fault. If he had not crossed paths with the young girl, then none of the rumors would exist. It was no revelation that it had all been because of money, the one thing that he could give her to help, even if just a little. It felt a little underhanded, but he hoped that if he gave her the money he got from winning the bet over her, maybe that would cancel the dirty feeling. "Don't worry, Miss Hardy, this is not another debt to fall into," Bjorn said. He wanted to reassure her that this was not like the time with the deer antler trophy. "Your Highness, you would just give me money?" Erna said. "Why?" She looked at Bjorn warily and blushed. As expected, Erna was a little cautious about accepting money from him without any thought of returning the favor. A knock came at the door just as Bjorn turned back to Erna and was about to speak. Mrs. Fitz pushed open the door and came only a little way into the room. She seemed bewildered and maybe a little flustered. It must be something important. "An order from His Majesty, the King. You are to attend him at the palace at once, Your Highness." By the time Prince